Revolutionary Imagination, Chicago's Surrealism from Object to Activism. This symposium and a range of associated events, including an opening tonight at the Arts Club of Chicago at 6 p.m., have been made possible with the support of the Terra Foundation for American Art and its presenting partner, the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation, as part of the Art Design Chicago initiative to explore the legacy of Chicago's artists and designers. I'd also like to thank the Franke Institute for the Humanities, the France Chicago Center, the Arts Club of Chicago, and the Art History Department of the University of Chicago for their support. And profound thanks too go to my organizing partners, Janine Myleaf and Christine Maring, and all of our associates who assisted along the way, especially Evan Hayes, Elisa Padilla-Drexler, and Tamara Smith at the University of Chicago, and Jenna Lyle and Daly Arnett at the Arts Club of Chicago. The city of Chicago has long been recognized for the central role it played in the history of the collection and display of Surrealist art. At the Vanguard, the Arts Club of Chicago introduced Surrealism to local audiences beginning in the late 1920s, inspiring young artists who came to work in Surrealistic styles, while private collectors like Joseph and Joy Shapiro and Edwin and Lindy Bergman facilitated the growing public visibility of Surrealist art in Chicago, as their repositories began to filter into our institutions from mid-century forward. But it was not until the 1960s that a group of young Chicagoans with roots in the student movement and the Industrial Workers of the World Union, or the Wobblies, began to truly participate in the avant-garde group dynamics and experimental artistic practices that characterized the Surrealist group in Paris, still orbiting the center of gravity of Andre Breton through his death in September 1966. So I have here the IWW Solidarity Bookshop, run by Franklin Rosemont beginning in 1964, and an early Rene Crevel poster that the Chicago Surrealist movement distributed, not only in the windows of their of Solidarity Bookshop, but also on the streets of Chicago, repasting them to walls. It was a distribution point, the Solidarity Bookshop, for radical publications right alongside Surrealist publications, and really launched the group as it came to be defined. On one hand, Chicago curators and collectors did important work by making Surrealist aesthetics visible on the walls of our institutions. On the other, practicing Surrealist artists and poets dedicated to ongoing transatlantic dialogues produced more ephemeral, less commodifiable actions, publications and counter-publications, events and counter-events. Surrealists in Chicago challenged the institutionalization and commodification of Surrealist imagery at the expense of, as they saw it, authentic and potentially transformative Surrealistic practice. Over the course of half a century, beginning in 1966, after a formative trip to Paris by the young activists Penelope and Franklin Rosemont, and that was following upon Franklin's trip to Mexico City to meet Leonora Carrington earlier, the Chicago Surrealists, including Paul and Beth Garone, Robert Greene, Lester Joret, Eric Matheson, and Schlechter Duval, among others, maintained an ongoing relationship, first with the post-war Surrealist group in Paris, and then with the growing network of second-generation Surrealists around the world. The Rosemonts got to know Andre Breton and a set of young adherents to Surrealism like themselves when they lived briefly in Paris during the winter of 1965 and 66. It's worth noting, too, that they also met Guy Debord and interacted with the Situationist International at this point, and they expressed interest in the commonalities between the two movements, which were at the time very much at odds. And here I have a representation from Penny's perspective of the Rosemonts at the 1965 International Surrealist Exhibition, Les Cars Absolus, where they saw the collectively organized assemblage of household objects and appliances called the consumer. And I have here also the reproductions of this opening event. They're reproduced in Marche Gras. Meeting weekly with the Surrealist group in Paris cafes, they developed the practice of exquisite corpse, that is collective drawing or poetry, which they brought back with them to Chicago and introduced to the Surrealist group here. They also took up wandering the city, or flânerie. Records of these walks can be found in the pages of the Surrealist journal they founded, Arsenal, published sporadically between 1970 and 1989, following upon their involvement in the journal Rebel Worker. The Chicago Surrealist group came to function as an important hub for Surrealist activity in the United States, bringing Chicago's activist history to bear on broader dialogues about the transformative capacity of art, with major figures from Herbert Marcuse to Ted Jones. This independent publishing practice was itself a direct descendant of historical avant-garde operating procedure. Breton, for example, had helmed a prolific publishing practice with the aim of evading and supplanting existing artistic and literary institutions. The group's numerous tracts, journals, and edited volumes featuring English language translations of previously untranslated texts, particularly by Surrealist women in a volume edited by Penelope, and most recently Surrealist writings from Africa and the diaspora. This body of work has, over the last 50 years, dramatically expanded the global reach of Surrealist ideas and transformed scholarship on Surrealism. These volumes did not just disturb disciplinary divides that had marked the literary and art historical study of the movement, and frankly continue to do so. They utterly ignored them and set up camp on another planet entirely. In 1978, Franklin, for example, explicitly argued against the periodization of Surrealism as an interwar avant-garde that has nevertheless structured scholarship on the movement until only very recently. In his introduction to What is Surrealism, he wrote, "Most critical studies and anthologies of Surrealism in English have been presented as contributions to the study of French literature, or as documents of modern art," referring to Motherwell series, "or as background material to help us understand more significant writers or artists who have been influenced by Surrealism. And such literature has pretended that Surrealism as an organized movement no longer exists. The fact that a vast bourgeois cultural apparatus exists to broadcast such preposterous misinformation does not make the misinformation any less preposterous. To speak plainly, the Surrealist struggle did not end in 1966, any more than the struggle for communism ended in 1883 with the death of Karl Marx." Finally, in the spirit of Breton's preference for self-organized Surrealist exhibitions over exhibitions of Surrealism, Chicago Surrealists promulgated too an adversarial attitude to non-Surrealist curators, challenging the curatorial impulse to classify and historicize, and vocally rejecting particular artists and artworks, including the Chicago Picasso, among other things, which I'll show a few examples of. In particular, this pamphlet, Who Cares, about the Art Institute of Chicago Centennial, and this sticker, this condemned sticker that they posted on, quote unquote, repressive structures as a public service by the Surrealist movement. And then tracts rejecting Klaus Oldenburg's Bat column as a serviceable symbol of repressive authority, and an unadorned 100-foot-long billy club cleverly packaged as art. And rejecting Andy Warhol as the Richard Nixon of modern art, and the perfect embodiment of today's official culture. Accordingly, when William Rubin's 1968 exhibition, Dada Surrealism and Their Heritage, traveled to the Art Institute of Chicago, a small group among their ranks took to the steps of the museum to protest. In a tract critical of the show's historical containment of the original avant-garde movement and perceived opportunism, they argued that the present exhibition, designed precisely to obliterate the revolutionary character of Surrealism, to immerse the entire movement in pseudo-critical formaldehyde, and to encase it behind the thick glass walls of official history, has found Professor Rubin a most profitable choice. In contrast, they staged a counter-exhibition in an Old Town storefront dubbed the Gallery Bugs Bunny, and filled with, as a Chicago Tribune reviewer described, a whole carnival of exotica and a representative selection of Surrealist publications from around the globe. This event signaled a decade of activity along these lines, some of which we'll be hearing about today, before the group shifted its emphasis increasingly towards publishing, taking charge of the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company, a radical press here in Chicago. The work they produced in this context is very much in line with the major Surrealist media and techniques that we're familiar with, from the photogram and darkroom experiments over here on the left to the Surrealist object, collage, and painting, both biomorphic landscapes and more Dali-esque works. And I brought in a head screen in this group portrait of the Paris Dada participants at the opening of a Max Ernst exhibition in 1920, just to underscore the continuity between historical avant-garde group dynamics and motifs and those at play in the Chicago Surrealist movement, not only this kind of impulse to take the group photograph, but also this motif of the wheel, which is something I've been interested in exploring in the context of Paris Surrealism for a long time, and insofar as it's related kind of formally to the idea of revolution, and the way in which Chicago Surrealists kind of brought it into their space in a more particularly American way, something that fascinates me. And these are posters of further Bugs Bunny exhibitions that were staged in quick succession, so surrealist objects, revolutionary posters, and solo exhibitions for Franklin Rosemont and Schlechter Duval. So others will take up their enormous and important 1976 exhibition, but in terms of the notion of this Paris link that I'm trying to underscore here, this 1977 exhibition at the Hyde Park Art Center is really compelling due to their use of stickers, so these are just a few examples of the many quotes that they had printed on these square stickers and hung throughout the gallery in garlands and also posted kind of all over the gallery walls. And I think this really spoke to the surrealist tracts, the sort of pavillon of the 1920s, which in my explorations in archives have they're glued. There's often glue on the back of them, and it also relates to more situationist ideas, I think, of marking space. And as far as I understand, these stickers were available for people to take away with them. So in this momentous year, celebrating 50 years after the first exhibition at the Gallery Bugs Bunny, in a moment in which the revolutionary effect of our liberated imaginations is as open to question and debate as it is absolutely imperative to hope for, it seems right to return to the legacy of the Chicago Surrealist movement, side by side that of Surrealism in Chicago, even as I realize that this retrospective tone will rankle those who still unite around the exquisite corpse. By gathering scholars, participants, and friends of the group together here today, we hope not only to understand this important piece of Chicago's artistic and literary history, but also likewise to explore its afterlives and continued potentials, and finally to give it its due for the way in which it has influenced and structured our understanding of surrealism, and perhaps should do so more. So we'll start this morning with a panel of